Our speaker for this session is Denise Shick, the founder and director of Help for Families, a Christian ministry that reaches out to family members who are grappling with the emotional and spiritual issues encountered when a loved one identifies as transgender. Her story includes a father who dressed in her clothing and deserted the family, struggles with her own sexuality, alcohol, and thoughts of suicide. But her life has been redeemed through Jesus Christ. Ladies and gentlemen, Denise Shick.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm going to grab my notes just to kind of help me, because sometimes I can rabbit trail. How's everybody doing? You're going to stay awake with me? Okay. All right. That is my hope. Well, my story starts rather young. Most children are worried about learning arithmetic or what's for lunch at the cafeteria or what type of dessert they're going to have. My childhood is a little bit different, actually a lot different. As I entered third grade, my father had signed me up for ballet classes. Now, sure, I was excited at the opportunity, and I thought for the first time I was really grabbing my dad's attention. But what I noticed at my ballet classes was he would pull the chair up every time. He would sit in the front row and just stare. And it got after time and time again that I became very uncomfortable, and I didn't understand why. Why was I feeling uncomfortable? Why was he just staring at me in that way? Ballet classes ended, and my father had then signed me up for baton lessons. And at this time, I'm like, well, this is kind of all in one year. Again, just feeling a little bit weird from ballet classes, now baton lessons, but not having an understanding of what was really going on with them. School had ended that year, and I was washing the dishes as my dad came in the kitchen, and he said, Denise, come on outside. I want to talk with you. I followed him outside, and when I had gotten out there, we sat down, and I have to say, with what seemed seconds of him turning and looking at me and saying, I want to become a woman. I'm sitting there as a child in the green grass thinking, what is going on? I'm listening to my father, an adult, tell his 9-year-old daughter sort of details about his life that no child should hear. He did disclose at that time that he was sexually molested as a child, though he did not say who. And he would also give me the details of what he would, in a sense, bully my mother to do in going to buy him clothing and those sorts of activities. And then the conversation, if we could call it a conversation, ended with him saying, and you will know when I'm feeling like a woman because I will be doing this. And I silently left this time with my dad, and I thought, this is Dad over here, and this is Denise. We're two separate beings. This will not impact me. But I was so wrong. I immediately started to grieve the loss of my father. I wanted a dad. I needed a dad. And now he's trying to tell me that he wants to be a woman. So in other words, he doesn't want to be my dad, is how I was internalizing it. Well, again, I thought, this is, you work through the grief, you try to work through the sorrow, and that takes many years. But I didn't know that as a child. By the time I was 10 and 11 years old, as most children, come to looking at who are they, trying to discover themselves. At 11 years old, I found myself in my bedroom thinking that if God made a mistake and Dad was really supposed to be a woman, how do you know you're not supposed to be a boy? And playing that out in my bedroom. You see, I knew what I'd look like. I knew how I would walk. I'm playing this out in my bedroom, in the privacy in my own home. I knew what that would also mean for a relationship as an adult. And life just continued to bring chaos after chaos. As I'm struggling with my identity, I started to mature very young. And though Mother Nature was doing what it does, it felt like a cruel joke to me by the time I was in 4th grade. 4th and 5th grade, I started to notice some resentment towards my father, towards me, and a very uncomfortableness around him. And to the point where I honestly felt really uncomfortable even sitting at the supper table with him. It was a stare that I can still see today, that it just felt like somebody was trying to go right through you. And as time progressed with the situation at home and developing very young, and my father was kind of a smaller man, by the time I was in 6th and 7th grade, I discovered he was wearing my clothing. My mother worked afternoons, and so I was always the caretaker of my 4 younger siblings. And when you're starting to put away towels in the bathroom and noticing your clothing stuffed behind other towels, or you're sent out to Dad's truck to go get something and you realize there's something out there that's yours, or up in the attic, you get to the point where you can't be in denial anymore. You have to admit what's going on. And so I learned a code for my dresser. It was learning a code in my bedroom of how I would know if Dad was into my things. I wasn't sure where to go. A lot of what we hear from our speakers, such as, well, you know, when you've got the world around you and you're not feeling safe in your own environment for different reasons. My mother didn't know what my dad told me. See, I took the role of being the caretaker with her because she struggled with migraines. And if I tell Mom, then I'm going to make her sick. So I have to protect her. But in the meantime, I'm living this out in a very lonely way and deciding to keep it a secret, because who are you going to tell, Denise? If your girlfriend's parents know, they're not going to allow them to come over to the house. And the shame that I had taken on. By the time I was in 7th grade, I discovered alcohol. The perfect solution when you have babysitting money and lunch money. And it didn't matter if it was a football, basketball game, if it was a school dance. It didn't matter if it was in the middle of the high school day. You just simply went into the restroom and you knew who would be in there with you as you would guggle it away. It became the coping mechanism that I had used. You see, anything that could help me to give some escape from all the chaos going on at home between Dad and I privately was definitely a drug that I would choose. By the time I got into 8th grade, I thought, you know, the alcohol, it was almost like it wasn't numbing enough anymore, and looking for something stronger, and struggling with depression. Struggling with who I was, struggling in my own sexuality, struggling with value as a woman, looking at my body and not even feeling good about it, thinking that this is what Dad wants, feeling ugly. And I thought, you know, I can certainly take care of all this pain. We were hunters, didn't fear guns, and so I started to plan. God's so amazing. He knows what goes on inside our heads and our hearts at this time. I had everything all planned out. And we happened to be off school. And again, when I had younger siblings left in charge of them and caring for them, there happened to be a talk show on. And the talk show was about teenage suicide. And the fact that there was a young man that tried to commit suicide by way of a gun and only ended up in a coma actually scared me. It frightened me more of the fact that I could try to shoot myself and end up in a coma, but being able to hear my dad's voice or to know that he was around in that room. And that's the only thing that had stopped me from going through with this. So between discovering that the alcohol wasn't doing it, you know, the depression, looking for boyfriends. In 7th grade, I actually had 13 boyfriends. It was just looking for the love of a male. I wanted that affirmation. I wanted somebody to pay attention to me, to give me what I wasn't getting at home. I looked for the father figure in and through the neighborhood, with uncles, whoever. I would imagine this is my dad for the day. But every time the day ended, I'd have to go back home to reality. And God's amazing timing again, as we look at the TV show, something of that nature that makes you not to attempt suicide, to go into another phase of 9th grade where I thought, I'm just going to join the military. I'll get out of here. Nobody has to take care of me. I can't trust men because I can't trust dad. I'm not going to be like mom. I don't want to become a victim. And that was really my answer. And that, Denise, if you can just hang on a little bit longer, you'll be done with high school. But then God brought an amazing teenage boy into my life. And he really just seemed to have this genuinely care about me, who I was, invested time, obviously was very interested. And as I come to know him, we had several conversations that began about God. Now, my boyfriend then, who's now my husband, Mark, came from a Christian family. I was born and raised Catholic, which is where a lot of my solid faith comes from. But I had not personally known much about having Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. And so I'm listening to Mark and him talk about this, and I grew curious. I wanted to know more. Well, then Mark did the dangerous thing of buying me my first Bible. And you take a lost teenager that's looking for answers. And I found some of the very ones I struggled with: Genesis, creation, Deuteronomy 22:5, a man shall not dress in women's clothing. And then I moved to Proverbs 3:5, trust in the Lord your God with all your heart. And I sat there on my bed, no matter what, Denise, trust me. And just leaning how to dig in to my God so deep that he would be the one thing that would help me to pull through. Well, Mark and I were planning our wedding my senior year. We married a couple months after graduation. And as most girls, I'd like to go back. The time before our wedding, nothing was said, okay? Because we're still learning the denial game. If you don't say anything still to mom, it's not going on. If you don't ask dad, are you getting help, what's going on, it doesn't exist. So the pink elephant is still really sitting in the living room in our home. Mark and I had planned our wedding. My mother, who created my beautiful wedding gown for me, and everything's exciting, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, this is all gone. Dad's dealt with this. I walk up to greet my dad at the top of the stairs to put my arm in his. And as I put my arm in his, he turned and he looked at me and he said, I wish it were me in that gown. I knew it hadn't gone away magically. And yet inside I was screaming. My heart was screaming. It was just telling myself, put yourself together, Denise. Walk up the aisle, put a smile on the face. Nobody's got to know what was just said. Don't say a word. The whole time you're walking up the aisle and the cameras are going off, and to be honest, I was crying inside. My dad had stolen my wedding day from me. Time was amazing and how fast it can go. Before long, 10 years had gone by, and my mother had given me a call. And she said, Denise, could you come over? I've got your brothers and your sisters over here, and there's something that we need to talk about. My dad had been away on a business trip and had returned home. As far as I knew, that's what it was. As I walked into the living room, Mom sat down before us, and she looked and said, your dad is leaving me to become a woman. Obviously, these words weren't really a shock to me, so I'm looking at the dismay on my siblings' faces. And as they start to talk and to express their emotions while supporting our mother at this time. My mom said, if you would like to, any of you would like to go see your dad, he's out in the garage. One thing about being a child in this type of chaos, you really learn to have nerve to do things. You have courage. I walked out to the garage. And as I walked out, there we go. As I walked out to the garage, my dad was looking at this side at the wall, and I shut the door, and he turned around and he looked at me, and I said, "Won't you get some help? We don't want you to leave." Now, this might come as a surprise to you because, very honest, I had a hard heart. My heart was getting harder towards my dad, but the truth of it is that I loved him. I hated what was going on in our home and the behaviors. He just simply looked and he said, "I raised you kids, and now it's my time. I'm going." And I said, "Then I'm saying goodbye to my father because I no longer have one." I didn't have two mothers. And how do you explain this to other people? There is such a grief that goes with this. You see, it is like somebody has died, but there is no closure. We don't have a funeral to go to. We have somebody that is living he has taken another identity as Becky. I don't know who Becky is. Well, time had gone by again, and at this point it had been, you go from being married at 18, 10 years, my father had left, I was 28, and it would be 13 years later, and my mother would make another phone call. And she said, "I'm coming over, Denise. There's something I need to share with you." Well, my mom and I talked often. This wasn't anything out of the unusual for her to come over or me to go back and forth. When she came over, we left my 4 small children upstairs and we went downstairs. And she said, "Your dad's dying of esophagus cancer. And he wants you kids to all know." I said, "Oh, okay." See, my heart was growing very hard through the years. After all, he's the one that left us. My mother had left. I cut the remaining pictures of him out of my wedding. I took the jewelry that he had bought me through the years, not sure who he was really buying it for, but had trashed it. I was hurting. God was bringing all this back up again. And immediately the Lord said, "You go and forgive your dad." I'm thinking, I don't think so. He deserves this. He deserves my anger, my righteous anger that I thought I had. But God won. Did you ever try to win a battle with the Lord? How well did that go for you? Didn't go very well for me. 2 weeks had gone by and my husband was working out of state, so I called my brother, asked him to join me. I asked our mother not to let him know that we were coming. I knew I needed to work up the courage to make this visit. As my brother had pulled down the road and we walked up to his house, and I'm looking at the lawn and everything, and to be honest, it just looks like something an elderly lady would have her lawn fixed. And I knocked on my dad's door, and guess what? He didn't answer, but I did what God told me to do. So I was getting off the hook. And then my little brother says, "Denise, knock one more time." This time I knocked. And when I did, I seen somebody come towards the window. And all I could think of was, look at his eyes, Denise. Look at his eyes. Don't let everything else distract you. He opened up the door. He said, "Come on in." As we were talking, or he was sharing, I said, "How are you feeling?" That was the initial thing. What do you say to a father you haven't seen in 13 years? What do you say to a father that you've had no communication? And obviously some of this was on my part. But when I get to it, what do you say? "How are you doing?" 10 minutes went by and I realized he doesn't have a clue who we are. And I finally said to him, "Do you know who we are?" "Yeah, you're from hospice." I said, "No, this is your son, and I'm Denise, your daughter." For the first time in my life with this very hard man, and I mean hard because he was an angry, hurtful adult, I seen tears start to well up in his eyes. And he got up and came over to give us a hug. We couldn't hug him back. But I can tell you, to allow him to hug me was one step for Jesus. He sat down and we talked more about his health, about the condition of his cancer, and the fact of knowing that he was attending an LGBT church that encouraged this, that was enabling his behavior and his decisions because they didn't want anybody to feel not welcomed. He said, I'm in a good place. Finally got to the place where my brother and I thought it's time to go. We left, got in the car, put my hands together and said, I did what you asked, God. I'm done. Like I really said to my dad, I forgive you for all that you've done to me. And when we're obeying God and fulfilling what we're supposed to do, don't think Satan's not going to come back at you immediately and take that from you. Because as I said to my father in his living room, I forgive you. My dad looked at me and he said, I'm sorry, Denise, I don't remember much of what I did to you. And everything starts reeling back. But thank God I knew what was happening, and I didn't receive that. Well, what I discovered after this visit with my father was that my heart was really growing to want to know him as an adult. You see, I knew everything he told me at 9 years old. And I put some pieces together myself at that point. But to know your father as an adult and to be better prepared to handling some of the information that you're receiving. And so I would call him often. And in calling him, I found that I had a desire to get to know him more. And then we received a phone call from his one friend from church, and she said, your dad's not going to come out of the hospital this time. His body is overcome with the cancer. And to see how my family had rallied against my dad. I had brothers from out of state. It didn't matter. They drove in. My father was 4 hours away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania from where I lived, and my husband and I and my mother and my sister took numerous trips there. And nothing prepares a daughter or a wife or a father, whoever it is, to walk into a hospital room with their loved one and to see them in pink fuzzy slippers and a women's nightgown and teddy bears all around. It begins to suck your heart and take your breath away. My mother was grieving all over again. Though she had an annulment from the Catholic Church, she never gave up that he would come back and that they would resolve the problems they had. At this time, we knew that Dad wasn't going to come home to be Dad. His grandchildren weren't going to know him. There's a lot of grieving that went on. God was also doing a lot of healing for our family. It's amazing at how you think that you're obeying God and you're not really going to be blessed for the obedience of what we do. The last time I went to go see my father, my husband and I had left early. And I'd been scrambling for a couple months now, looking for the right scriptures. Show me, Lord, what I can share with him. And finally found those scriptures. And when Mark and I walked in, and Mark sat over by the window, and the nurse came in, and she said, he's in a coma. And my heart dropped. And then I thought, I don't know, maybe he can hear me, right? We don't really know. We hear from people that are in comas, and then they say, well, I heard this one's voice, and I heard you tell me a story. And so I grabbed the chair, and I sat next to him. I started to share the scripture and share my heart some more. And as I held his hand, I realized he was starting to grow cold. And so I am warming up. This hardened little girl's heart was warming up to her dad to try to keep his body warm. It was getting late, and if you ever left teenage boys in care of two little sisters, you know your time limit of a day is about over. So as Mark and I prepared to leave, we waited for my sister and brother-in-law to come because we just simply didn't want to leave him there without anybody. My mother was not able to make this trip. And when they arrived, I had a few moments alone with my dad in that room. And I sat in the chair and I'm looking around the hospital room and realizing all that God had done. I realized the healing for our family. I realized the opportunity to tell my dad, I love you. I don't agree with this, but I do love you. And it was at the time where I bent over and kissed my father's forehead and lifted my head up that I realized what God's amazing grace is all about. And I knew without a doubt in my heart that I had forgiven this man. I had forgiven my father of all the pain that was inflicted on our family. Well, Satan doesn't just let us go there, does he? He tries to take us another step further. And what happened when my husband and I left 40 minutes later, my sister called and she said that he's passed on. And again, I thought, okay, Lord, I've done everything that you've asked me to do. I've done it all. You know, it's on to life, another chapter of life. The friend that was supposed to take care of the funeral arrangements and everything, though that she had paid and done all of that, she didn't want to take care of his home. And for some reason, she calls my mother and says, I want Denise to do this. I can't. And my mother calls me and says, Cecilia can't do this. She wants you to do it. I felt like you got to be kidding me, right? I couldn't believe that I was getting felt like I was getting slapped in the face again of something else to go through. I walked into the living room, my mother and my sister came, and we went doing this together as a team, or more so. And I have to tell you, I was not prepared emotionally, I was not prepared spiritually, and I definitely was not prepared physically for the way that this visit would impact me. As I went through the normal rooms, the living room and the kitchen and everything, just normal rooms, I went downstairs. I made the mistake of going downstairs. And when I went downstairs to this particular room, I had to throw up. My head was pounding, and still being the adult, taking care of Mom, said to her, I might be coming down with the flu. I need to go to, my brother's house and go lay down. I knew what had happened. I knew it finally had tumbled down, and I was down on the floor, flat out. The next day, we got up and went back to the house. And through prayer and my brother praying over me, I managed to make it upstairs. And without those prayers, I wouldn't have been able to make it upstairs. For a daughter to walk into her father's bedroom with a female attire, with it so feminine, was one thing that I was preparing for, but it's a little bit different when you're going through those clothes and trying to pack them up for Salvation Army or somewhere to take them off to. And then I went into the room that was on the right, and that was my second mistake at my dad's house. Because you see, there were all these personal letters, faxes, cards, and 91 dolls. So I'm looking at these dolls all around me, and I'm going through this chaos, trying to still make sense of even more of my dad's life. I discovered the documentation where he changed his Social Security card, where he had his name officially changed, where he had documentation of when his estrogen shots were. Everything was on the calendar, more of a diary. And then I started to find letters from other transgender males to females, dads that have left their children, that have left their wives, and talking about their situations with their children and the challenges that they were facing and the heartache, but this was something that they had to do, and to leave their families, and to see the situations that some wives were left in. And then I get to the copy of my dad's note here at the very bottom that you see where it's written, where he is saying that he will not harm himself, showing that he had suicidal tendencies. And then up above is a letter that I found from my grandfather. I found many letters between he and my grandfather when my grandfather's trying to make sense of this, trying to understand. And my dad asking him time and time again to refer to him as Becky, to refer to him as a daughter. And where my grandfather in the specific letter says, I don't know what may have caused this. The only thing that I can remember is that up until the age of 15, you would pee the bed at night. I'm thinking, hello, Grandpa, what 15-year-old boy, what psychologically else may have happened that I was not aware of. Then the letter, the yellow letter here, was a letter that my dad wrote to my mom, that I take it she gave it back to him because it was addressed and it was stamped to the address of our home. And it was where he was asking to come back home and to live with her, but I can only do that under the situation here. And how long will you let me wear women's nightgowns to bed? And the kids will have to learn that this is just the way it is. And just almost a documentation of, I'll come back home to you, honey, but this is how it's going to be. To realize the pressure that he consistently tried to put my mother under. And yet, looking at this whole picture and realizing what devastation had taken place in his own life. We don't hear on the news, you don't hear on NBC or ABC the truth behind some of these families, the struggles that are going on. You know, for a wife, to be quite honest with you, she can't fight an invisible woman that he's having a delusional affair with, in a sense. She has no way to fight back on that. And the bequests that are put before her are demeaning and lack of value. For parents, they've got a war against our educational institutes today. Their child can go to school and be taken on a different identity, gender identity, and the parents don't have a clue that this is happening to their child until much later, most of the time. Mothers that become so depressed from hearing this news, from grieving the loss of the child that they feel, that they've known, many times end up on medications for depression, anxiety, and to be able to sleep at night. Fathers that just want another man to come alongside of them and to understand what they're going through and the challenges that they face, to be there to pray with them, to offer support. Siblings, young siblings, when they've got a teenage sibling that's transitioning, and for instance, this one young boy I know where his teenage sister is transitioning, and he keeps calling her sister by the she and her pronouns, and the little boy is the one that's being punished. And then you have the children that are left behind. If it's 3, 5 years old and up, they're grieving the loss of a parent. They can't simply just, it's not a light switch. You turn off and on. Dad's here, dad's gone. It's her, it's all of that chaos. It's too much for them to handle. And yet, what happens today in school with the children that don't accept their father, let's say their father transitioning, the young children, especially if it's a male, the other children that know will say, why don't you just go home and put on a dress like your daddy does? If you're an older adult that's a child, you have the bullyism of your own peers in your workplace. Everybody believes this ideology, and if you don't, how dare you speak against it? Daughters that are receiving by text messages or emails pictures of their dads as they're transitioning to show them the pictures, when they are not in approval of this and they're grieving their own loss. Everybody loses. And we as the church body, if we don't come together and understand this issue so that you can support a mom, a dad, a wife, a husband, a child, whoever. Maybe it's the grandparents. They need you as God's people to stand alongside of them. Don't fear them. Don't make them feel ostracized, like as if they're on the outside. We need you. One of the last things that I had discovered with my dad, through the things that he had written, he wrote a lot of poems, and his poems expressed his pain and what he was going through and how he's seen the outside world. And this one here really struck me. Change, change, change. Yet I am missing something. The something is completeness. He died at 63 years old, and yet he was still searching to be complete. Thank you.